The problem arrived quietly, which is part of what makes it so hard to name. It did not arrive as failure. It arrived in the middle of something that was, by any available measure, success. The career that was built, the relationship that was real, the life that, described to someone who didn't have it, would sound like enough. Would sound, depending on the description, like more than enough. And in the middle of it, at some ordinary moment, you had the experience of looking at everything around you and feeling something you did not have a word for that was not quite dissatisfaction, and not quite depression, and not quite ingratitude, but that had something of all three in it, and that arrived with a particular quality of shame because nothing about your circumstances warranted it. You have been chasing the correction for longer than you have admitted. The correction arrives in different forms, depending on the season. Sometimes it is novelty, the new project, the new destination, the new version of something you already have, but in a configuration you haven't tried yet. Sometimes it is intensity, the pursuit of experience that is extreme enough to produce genuine feeling, rather than the ambient flatness that has become the background register of ordinary days. Sometimes it is planning, the detailed construction of a future arrangement in which the conditions will finally be right, in which the thing that is currently insufficient will have been remedied by whatever is currently missing. The planning produces a temporary elevation. The new thing arrives, the elevation subsides, the flatness returns, often faster than the last time, requiring a larger input to produce the same effect. You have probably begun to suspect that you are the problem, that the issue is not the circumstances, but something in you, some deficiency of appreciation, some hardwired incapacity for sustained contentment, some version of being broken that the right circumstances were always going to fail to fix. This suspicion is half right and entirely misdiagnosed, and the misdiagnosis is keeping you in exactly the place the correct diagnosis would allow you to leave. Erich Fromm made a distinction that the contemporary framework for thinking about boredom almost entirely lacks, and it is the distinction on which everything else in this argument turns. He separated what he called the having mode of existence from the being mode, and these are not simply two different relationships to objects or possessions. They are two different structures of selfhood, two different answers to the question of where experience is generated and what it is for. In the having mode, experience is consumed. It arrives from outside. It is taken in. It produces a temporary state, and it is used up. The self in this mode is essentially a container, sophisticated perhaps, with refined tastes and demanding criteria, but a container nonetheless. Its aliveness depends on what is being poured into it. In the being mode, experience is generated from the inside, not manufactured, not willed into existence through effort of attention, but arising from a quality of genuine engagement with what is encountered, in which the self brings something to the meeting rather than simply receiving from it. The self in this mode is not a container, it is a participant. Its aliveness does not depend on the novelty or intensity of what arrives, because what arrives is being met with a quality of presence that transforms even the ordinary into something that registers. The person addressed here has been operating almost entirely in the having mode. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable outcome of a specific formation, of a life organized around achievement, around the accumulation of experiences and credentials and conditions, around the serial production of circumstances that were supposed to feel like arrival and consistently felt like a temporary reprieve from the flatness that returned as soon as the novelty subsided. The flatness is not a symptom of insufficient circumstances. It is the structural experience of a self that has been trained to consume rather than generate, that has learned through years of practice to locate the source of its aliveness entirely outside itself, and that therefore finds itself, in the absence of sufficient external input, effectively empty. Here is what this looks like in the specific domain where it tends to be most difficult to examine. Your relationships have a particular quality that you may have noticed without naming. In the beginning, they are alive in a way that later seems unavailable, not because the other person changed, though they may have, but because the beginning was organized around discovery, around the influx of new information about someone who was not yet known. And that influx produced the experience of being genuinely engaged. Then the discovery completed itself, not entirely but substantially. And what remained was the person, the actual person, who is not new, whose particularities are familiar, whose way of occupying a room and responding to situations and making coffee in the morning has been learned. And the aliveness that the discovery produced did not transfer to the person themselves. You probably interpret this as evidence about the relationship, as evidence that the connection has faded, that the original feeling was infatuation rather than love, that this particular person is not the one who can sustain your engagement over time. You are gathering evidence for a conclusion that would justify a search for something that produces the original feeling. And the conclusion is available because in any relationship of sufficient duration, there is always evidence of insufficiency if you are looking for it. The relationship that cannot produce the discovery aliveness will fail the test if discovery aliveness is the test you are running. What Fromm was pointing at, the thing that tends to arrive as a genuinely disturbing recognition when the argument finally lands, is that you are running the having mode test on an experience that only the being mode can deliver. Sustained aliveness in a relationship is not produced by the influx of new information about the other person. It is produced by the quality of attention you bring to what you already know, by the willingness to encounter the familiar person as genuinely present, as genuinely distinct, as genuinely other in ways that your accumulated knowledge has not exhausted. This is not a feeling, it is a practice. And it is a practice the having mode cannot perform because the having mode can only receive what arrives, and in a long relationship, the arrival rate of genuinely new information has substantially decreased. The boredom you feel in the relationship is not information about the relationship. It is information about the mode. William James described habit as the great flywheel of civilization and meant this positively, that the automatization of the ordinary frees conscious attention for the extraordinary, that the habitual is what allows human beings to function without exhausting their resources on the routine. But the observation has a shadow version that James acknowledged, and that tends to get underemphasized. What becomes habitual also becomes invisible. What becomes invisible stops generating experience. The commute that was novel for 2 weeks and then became the space between places. The meal that was anticipated and then became the default. The relationship that was discovery and then became the assumed context for everything else. The career that was a goal and then became the job. Habit is the great economizer, and what it economizes in the domain of experience is aliveness. The routine doesn't feel like anything in particular, which is the point. That's what makes it sustainable as routine. And the cost is the progressive reduction of the domain of life that generates genuine engagement. For someone organized around achievement, this process has a specific shape. Each achievement is a goal until it arrives, and a goal generates the experience of movement, of being oriented towards something, of existing in the present, as the approach to a desired future. The movement is alive. The arrival is not, or not for long, because arrival converts the goal into the context, and what was alive as approach becomes invisible as background. The self, trained to generate its aliveness through the pursuit of external states, has now achieved the state, and has discovered that the state, inhabited, is not the experience the pursuit promised. This produces the achievement paradox that most people in this situation have noticed but not resolved. The things that were supposed to be enough aren't, and the not enoughness is not fixed by getting more of them. More career success produces the same curve. More relationship security produces the same curve. More experiences of travel or intensity or novelty produce the same curve, now compressed. the elevation shorter, the return to baseline faster, the requirement for the next input arriving sooner, you are not getting better at receiving experience. You are becoming more efficient at using it up. Dostoevsky's underground man, before he descends into the sustained self-torment that dominates the second half of the narrative, produces in the first section an observation about the cultivated man's relationship to action and feeling that is rarely cited in this context, but that bears directly on the problem. His argument, conducted from inside the very condition he is describing, is that excess consciousness, which he has and which he cannot stop, prevents the kind of wholehearted engagement with experience that simpler people apparently have. He is aware always of the constructed quality of his own responses. He sees the gap between what he feels and what he is supposed to feel, between what he does and what he intended to do, between the experience as it is marketed to him and the experience as it arrives. The awareness prevents the simple taking in. He cannot be swept away because he is always slightly outside the thing being swept, watching himself be swept and finding the watching more real than the swept. This is the person being addressed here, to a degree that tends to arrive as recognition when it is named. You have been living in the bracket. The experience happens, and the commentary on the experience happens simultaneously, and the commentary frequently has the louder signal. You are at the concert, and you are also observing yourself at the concert, rating the quality of your own engagement, noting that the engagement is somewhat less than you expected, constructing the account of the evening that you will offer later. You are in the conversation, and you are also monitoring the conversation from outside it, tracking its significance, comparing it to previous conversations of similar structure, arriving at a verdict about whether this one merits the investment it is requiring. You are in your own life, and you are also its most attentive critic, and the criticism never stops long enough for the life to actually happen to you. This is not intelligence's fault, though it is intelligence's consequence. It is the product of a specific formation, a self that learned early to relate to its own experience as material to be assessed rather than as the actual field in which it exists. And it produces the specific boredom that cannot be corrected by more interesting material, because the issue is not the material. It is the stance toward the material that prevents any material from actually landing. Jung's account of the persona is relevant here in a direction that tends not to get discussed in relation to boredom. The persona, the social self, the face that interfaces between the psyche and the world, is constructed in the service of legibility and function. It is what allows a person to operate effectively in the social domain, to fulfill roles, to be the professional and the partner and the parent and the friend in ways that each of those contexts requires. The problem is not the persona. The problem is what happens to the rest of the psyche while the persona is doing its work. Everything that is not accommodated by the persona goes somewhere else. The aliveness that is not compatible with the professional presentation, the wildness, the grief, the genuine intensity, the things that would be disproportionate or inexplicable or threatening to the social contexts in which the persona operates. These go into the shadow, not the moral shadow of dangerous impulses, but the vitality shadow of everything that has been determined incompatible with the presented self. And a person who has been running a highly effective persona for a long time, who is very good at being what they are supposed to be in each of the contexts they occupy, has, in the process, stored in the shadow a very large amount of what is most alive in them. The boredom is, in part, the experience of living entirely in the persona. The flatness is the flatness of a self that has been reduced to its most socially presentable components, that has been so thoroughly organized around the role that the rest of it has become inaccessible. The person who chases intensity and novelty and new experience is often chasing the experience of being genuinely alive, which is available not through more stimulating circumstances, but through the recovery of the content that was compressed into the shadow to make the persona possible. This is not comfortable to hear because it implies that the life that is boring is not insufficient. It is sufficient for the persona and genuinely inadequate for the full person. And the full person is in the shadow, which is not a comfortable neighborhood to visit, and not one that can be reached by optimization of the existing conditions. Here is the unexpected application, the one that the argument up to this point has been building toward without naming. Think about the things you used to love, not the things you currently pursue because they are productive or appropriate or consistent with the person you have become. The things that once produced in you a quality of engagement that was not assessed or rated or experienced from the outside, that were simply what was happening completely while they were happening. The things you did before you learned to have opinions about your own engagement. For some people, it is a specific creative activity that was gradually replaced by more serious pursuits. For some, it is a way of being in a particular place, a landscape, a room, a quality of light at a specific time of day, that was once simply received, and that at some point became an aesthetic category to be appreciated correctly. For some, it is a quality of conversation or of physical movement or of solitude that was once simply inhabitable and is now something that has to be arranged, and that, once arranged, is observed from the outside and found to produce less than was expected. These are not activities you need to return to. They are tracers. They are pointing at the mode that was once available and has been progressively replaced by the having mode and the specific moments in which the replacement happened, which are frequently the moments in which the activities were absorbed into the self-project, into the development of a person with particular tastes and capacities, into the production of a life that could be described coherently to others as a certain kind of life. The moment the thing became part of the project was the moment the thing began to be used up, because the having mode uses things up. That is its structure. The being mode does not use things up because it does not consume. It participates, and participation can be renewed because it is not extractive. The complication arrives here, and it is genuine, which means it cannot be resolved by the preceding argument. The prescription that seems to follow is, stop consuming experience and start generating meaning from the inside. Be more present. Engage differently. Shift from having to being. These instructions are accurate as descriptions of what the solution would involve and useless as guides to achieving it, because the shift from the having mode to the being mode is not accomplished by deciding to shift. It is a structural change in the relationship between the self and experience, and structural changes are not produced by intention at the level of behavior. The specific obstacle is what Fromm identified as the dependency that the having mode produces. A self organized around external input does not simply fail to generate aliveness internally, it loses, over time, the capacity to do so. The dependency is real in the same structural sense that any sustained dependency is real. The system has organized itself around the input, and the withdrawal of the input produces not a return to some prior state of self-sufficiency, but a genuine experience of absence, of interior emptiness that is not philosophical, but felt. The person who decides to generate meaning from the inside and then sits quietly waiting for this to happen discovers that what is inside, initially, is the flatness the external input was covering. This is the moment at which most people reach for the next input, and it is precisely the moment at which the structural change would have to begin if it is going to begin, which means the moment of the flatness, the genuinely felt interior emptiness, is not the evidence that the project has failed. It is the beginning of the project. The person sitting in the flatness without immediately reaching for the correction is doing something that the having mode cannot produce. They are not generating aliveness. They are learning to be present to its absence without finding the absence intolerable. This is slower and less legible as progress than anything the achievement organized self is familiar with. It does not produce milestones. It does not generate experiences that can be described to others as evidence of growth. It produces, over time and inconsistently, a quality of presence to ordinary experience that is not excitement and not the elevation of novelty, but something quieter, something closer to what the word alive means before it gets tangled with the word interesting. Marcus Aurelius had a specific practice that tended to produce this, though he did not frame it in terms of aliveness or boredom. He called it returning to the present, confining attention to the actual situation, stripping away the commentary and the comparison and the evaluation of how the current moment measures against the desired future or the remembered past, and simply being in contact with what is actually here. He returned to this instruction obsessively across 12 books of private notes, which is evidence not of the practice's failure, but of how consistently the mind resists it. What the practice produces, when it actually works, which is not always, is not an intensification of experience, but a change in the quality of contact with experience. The ordinary moment is not rendered extraordinary, it is rendered fully itself, which is a different thing. The conversation that was being rated from outside becomes, briefly, simply what is being said by this specific person in this specific moment, which is stranger and more particular and more alive than the categorized version that the having mode can receive. This is what the boredom with your own life is actually the absence of, not more interesting circumstances. Contact with the circumstances that are already here, at a quality of presence that your current mode of engaging with experience consistently prevents. The circumstances are not the problem. The stance toward circumstances, the one that turns every experience into evidence for or against a thesis about whether this life is working, the one that runs the continuous assessment in parallel with the experience itself, that is the problem. And it is a problem that more interesting circumstances cannot solve, because the stance travels with you into whatever circumstance you arrange. Camus' Sisyphus is the strange figure who keeps appearing in any genuine inquiry into this problem, because his situation is designed to make the having mode's logic obviously inadequate. Sisyphus cannot acquire his way out. There is nothing to achieve. There is no arrangement of external circumstances that can be reached through effort and maintained as a resolution. There is only the task, repeating, and the descent, and the task again. And Camus insists that within this condition, which is the human condition stripped of its usual consolations, the possibility of genuine engagement remains, not produced by the circumstances, which are as bad as circumstances can be, but produced by the quality of orientation Sisyphus brings to the circumstances. The aliveness Camus is pointing at is not dependent on the stone staying at the top. It is not even particularly interested in whether the stone stays at the top. It is the quality of being fully present to the pushing, not despite its futility, but as the actual activity in which his existence is occurring. Most people read this as a bleak thought and decline to follow it further. It is the opposite of bleak. It is the most direct available refutation of the having mode's logic, which is that aliveness depends on arrival, on the stone reaching the top and staying there, on the circumstances finally producing the state that all the effort has been organized around. Camus is saying that the state was never in the circumstances. It was always in the quality of engagement with whatever was actually happening. You have been waiting for the stone to stay. That is what the chasing of novelty is. It is the search for the circumstance that will be sufficient enough that the having mode can finally rest, finally feel that the arrival has been real, finally stop requiring the next input to maintain the experience of being alive. The stone is not going to stay. It was never going to stay. And the life you have, with its familiarity and its repetition and its ordinary days that do not announce themselves as significant, is the actual field in which everything available to you is occurring. The question is not how to make that field more interesting. The question is whether you are willing to actually be in it. The self that has been trained to consume experience is not broken, but it has been trained to look for aliveness in exactly the place it cannot be found, and to dismiss as insufficient the place where it actually lives. The distinction is not between an exciting life and a boring one. It is between a life that is being used and a life that is being inhabited. You have been using your life with considerable skill. You have extracted from it the experiences that the having mode values, the achievements, the novel inputs, the evidence of a life well organized toward desired outcomes. And you have experienced, alongside the extraction, the progressive return of the flatness that the next input was supposed to resolve. The flatness is not a deficiency in the available material. It is the experience of a self encountering its own emptiness, the emptiness that the continuous external input was both producing and covering. A self that has outsourced its aliveness cannot generate aliveness in the absence of the outsourced supply. That is not a character flaw. It is a structural fact about a formation that was assembled in response to conditions that valued production over presence, achievement over engagement, the legible life over the inhabited one. What is on the other side of this is not a more interesting life. It is something that will initially feel like less, quieter, less elevated, less organized around the promise of arrival. What it is, more precisely, is the experience of your own existence from the inside, rather than from the position of the person observing whether the experience is sufficient, whether that is available to you now in the life you currently have, without rearranging the circumstances that you have already correctly identified as insufficient for the purpose. That is the question that the having mode cannot answer. Not because the answer is no, but because the question can only be answered by the thing it is asking about. And that thing has not been present to your life, at least not consistently, for longer than you have been willing to admit. The circumstances are not what needs to change. The one who is waiting for them to is.